My name is Joanna Pierce, and this is how I found out I was no longer welcome at my own table. It was supposed to be a celebration, my retirement party. 42 years teaching English at Westbridge High. Hundreds of students. Dozens of awards. Every fall musical chaperoned. Every late paper graded. Every broken-hearted teenager given tea and tissues in room 207. I wasn't expecting confetti or a marching band. Just a little gathering with my family. My daughter, Marin, had said she'd take care of it. "Let me plan it, Mom," she'd insisted. "You've done enough." So when I got the email from my school, looking forward to your speech next Friday at the retirement party, 5:30 p.m., hosted by Marin Sinclair, I smiled. That was my daughter. Organized. Polished. A little cold sometimes, but always dependable. I responded, looking forward to it. "Do you need me to bring anything?" No reply. That should have been the first sign. But mothers like me, we don't see the red flags when we've trained ourselves to forgive the wind that blows them. Friday came. I wore a navy dress Marin once called teacher chic. I curled my hair the way my late husband, Frank, used to love. And I brought a lemon cake, my student's favorite. I wasn't trying to make a scene. I just thought, well, maybe it would be nice to contribute. The venue was a small event hall near campus. I taught every one of the Sinclair kids there. My name was etched on the cornerstone plaque for 20 years of service. I parked in the back, walked up the steps, and paused at the double doors. I could already hear laughter inside. Piano music. Glasses clinking. A crowd buzzing with life. I opened the door. And no one noticed. The room was full. My principal, my colleagues, former students, even the mayor. Tables with gold centerpieces. A banner that said, "Congratulations, Joanna," in shimmering cursive letters. And yet, no one turned to greet me. Not even Marin. She was near the podium, laughing with a man from the school board, wearing a tailored cream suit, looking every inch the politician's wife she'd become. When she finally saw me, it wasn't surprise in her eyes. It was irritation. She walked over, still holding her glass of champagne. "Mom," she said, not unkindly, just brisk, "you weren't supposed to be here yet." "I came a little early," I said, smiling. "I brought lemon cake." Her eyes dropped to the tinfoil-covered tray in my hands. "Oh. Well, we already had dessert catered." She took the tray with 2 fingers, like it might spill, and handed it to an assistant. "Just put it somewhere, please." I stood there in my best dress, smiling like I didn't feel the sting. A few minutes later, Marin stepped up to the microphone. "Good evening," she said, confident, polished. "We're here tonight to honor an exceptional woman, Joanna Pierce. A woman who's touched so many lives, not just as a teacher, but as a mentor, a guide, a quiet force in this community." The room applauded. I stayed in the back, watching her praise me like a ghost. "She's taught generations of students," Marin continued. "And now, as she begins this next chapter, we celebrate not just her achievements, but her legacy." Another round of applause. Then she smiled brightly and said, "And I think we can all agree, no one will miss giving out detention slips more than Joanna." Laughter. Laughter that rolled across the room, even from people who knew better. I didn't. I just stared at her. She knew what she was doing. I never gave detentions lightly. I held those kids accountable because no one else did. But to her, it was a punchline. A few people looked back at me, then looked away, like I didn't belong in the room with my own name on the banner. When the speeches ended, a slideshow began. Photos of me in classrooms at award ceremonies, hugging graduates. I waited to feel seen. But every time my image flashed on screen, it felt further from who I actually was. I walked toward the cake table where my tray had been left, untouched, off to the side like an afterthought. The catered pastries gleamed under soft lights. My lemon cake, slightly dented from the foil, sat behind them like something someone forgot to throw away. That's when it hit me. I was not the guest of honor. I was a prop in my daughter's carefully staged production. And I suddenly couldn't breathe. I stepped outside. No one followed. Not even Marin. I sat on the bench near the back exit, clutching my purse like it could anchor me. The night air was cool against my cheeks. That's when I remembered something Frank used to say: the people who clap the loudest aren't always the ones who see you. I didn't go back inside. I didn't wait for the closing toast or the group photo. I stood up, dusted off my dress, and walked to my car. In the passenger seat was a copy of a scrapbook I'd made for Marin's wedding. Photos, letters, ticket stubs from her first school play, a pressed flower from her father's funeral bouquet. I was going to give it to her tonight. A surprise. A gift. A reminder. I left it there, because suddenly I wasn't sure she deserved it. I drove home in silence, my knuckles white on the wheel. The lemon cake tray rattled softly in the trunk. That night, I sat in my kitchen, lit by one overhead bulb, and stared at the dark window. I didn't cry. Not then. Because something inside me had changed. Not a breaking. A shifting. The kind that happens when a mother finally realizes she spent her life being a chapter in someone else's story, when all along, she was the author. Before we continue, take a moment to let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe to more powerful stories like this one. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I lay in bed with the covers pulled to my chest, watching shadows move across the ceiling like they might spell out a reason. A reason why the daughter I raised with both hands and every ounce of love could now look through me like glass. By morning, the house was too quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels like forgetting. Like someone erased your voice from a place you spent your whole life filling. I made coffee out of habit, not desire. Drank it lukewarm while standing at the kitchen counter, still in the dress from the night before. My heels were kicked off near the front door, one on its side like it had given up mid-step. The newspaper on the table had a headline about local school budgets. A photo of Westbridge High's new principal shaking hands with the mayor. I taught that principal. She used to leave poetry scribbled in the margins of her homework. Raw, clumsy, beautiful. Now she was shaking hands in press releases, and I was just an anecdote in someone else's legacy. I thought about calling Marin. But what would I say? Hi, sweetheart. Just wondering why you hosted my retirement party without letting me sit at my own table? I could already hear her voice in my head, clipped and brisk. Mom, I didn't mean anything by it. You're being dramatic. Dramatic. That's the word she always used when she wanted me to disappear quietly. The same word she used when I cried at her graduation. When I tried to explain why I didn't remarry after Frank died. When I told her that lemon cake wasn't just cake, it was a memory. That word had become a muzzle. So instead, I did what I always do when I'm hurt. I cleaned. I started with the pantry. Threw out expired spices. Wiped down the shelves. Then moved to the linen closet. Refolded everything by color, by size, by fabric. Somewhere between the third towel and the fifth bottle of half-used shampoo, my hands stopped moving. I stood there, suddenly breathless, a folded sheet pressed to my chest. I hadn't updated the emergency contact forms in years. Every form in the filing cabinet, every legal document, still listed Marin. Every account, every note for the doctor, every line that asked, in case of emergency, who should we call? Her name. Not because she asked for it, but because I never questioned that she'd be there. I set the sheet down and walked to the living room. There, above the mantel, was the family photo from her wedding. The one I had paid for, even though she said the venue would handle the pictures. Frank was already gone by then, so it was just Marin and her new husband, Thomas, with me on the end, smiling, holding the bouquet she never mentioned after the ceremony. I took it down, not in anger, in acceptance, because I wasn't in that picture the way they were. I was added, cropped in like furniture. I wrapped the frame in newspaper and placed it in the hall closet. I didn't want to see myself the way they saw me anymore. That afternoon, I walked to the local bookstore. There was a new historical fiction novel I'd been eyeing, and the walk helped clear my mind. As I strolled past the bakery, where I used to take Marin for cinnamon rolls after report card days, I noticed the help wanted sign in the window. It caught me off guard. Not because I needed a job, I had just retired, but because something inside me whispered, You still want to be needed. I shook it off and kept walking. Picked up my book. Chatted briefly with the cashier, a young girl named Talia who wore thick-rimmed glasses and smelled like peppermint. You were a teacher, right? She asked, glancing at my purchase. 42 years, I said with a small smile. Just retired. She lit up. My mom talks about you all the time. Said you taught her to love writing again. That means something, you know. I nodded, thanked her, and left. But the tears didn't wait. They fell right there on the sidewalk behind my sunglasses. Because that's the thing about being invisible. Sometimes the world reminds you you're not, just long enough to make the loneliness worse when it returns. 2 days passed. Marin didn't call. Not to thank me for the cake. Not to ask why I left early. Not to check on the mother who had been her anchor since she was 5 and Frank died in a hospital bed holding my hand. I went about my routines. Watered the plants. Sorted old student thank you notes. Tried not to read the ones that said, "You were the only adult who ever believed in me." Tried not to wonder why that same belief hadn't been enough for my own daughter. Then came the baby shower. Her sister-in-law, Thomas's younger sister. An email invitation forwarded to me, almost by accident. My name listed after miscellaneous extended family. It was being hosted at Marin's house. The house I helped pay for when she and Thomas were newlyweds and their mortgage fell through. I had withdrawn from my retirement savings without a word. Take it, I told them. Build your life. Now I would enter that house as a guest. I thought about declining. But something in me, that small, rebellious ache that still wanted to believe in the girl who once clung to my legs at the zoo, made me go. I arrived early. I brought a gift, hand-knitted baby blankets, the softest ones I'd ever made. I'd started them the day Marin told me she was pregnant. I'd imagined her wrapping her baby in something woven from my hands, from my love. Marin opened the door, surprised. "Oh, you're early." I thought I'd help. I offered. She blinked. "Everything's pretty much set, but you can sit over there until the others arrive." She gestured to a corner chair near the window. Alone. So I sat. I smiled. I folded my hands. I watched as her in-laws arrived. Hugs, laughter, glasses of champagne, warm greetings. Then the introductions began. "This is Grandma Sinclair," Marin said proudly, beaming at Thomas's mother. "And this," she paused as she gestured vaguely toward me, "is my mom, Joanna." Just Joanna. Not Grandma. Not Nana. Not even my mother who taught me how to hold a baby without fear. Just Joanna. A name she used like punctuation. I sat in that chair for 2 hours. No one asked about the blanket. It was placed on the gift table, unwrapped, unmentioned. I left early. No one noticed. On the drive home, I whispered something I hadn't said out loud in years. I don't recognize her anymore. But the truth was harder to say. I don't recognize myself. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table with the baby blanket still folded in my lap. It had been returned to me. Not directly, of course. That would have required acknowledgement. Instead, I found it carefully tucked into a plastic bag near the umbrella stand as I left the baby shower. As if I had simply forgotten it. As if it hadn't taken me 4 months and 3 skeins of imported yarn to make. I stared at it, my fingers tracing the rows of pearl and knit, the little ridges that used to feel like love. Now they just felt like proof of how much time I had wasted making something for someone who no longer saw me. That's the thing about emotional abandonment. It rarely announces itself like a slammed door or a cruel word. It's slow, like fog creeping through the foundation. You don't realize it's suffocating you until your breath starts to catch for no reason at all. I folded the blanket once more and placed it in the chest at the foot of my bed, where Frank's favorite sweater still lay. I hadn't opened that chest in years. But that morning I did. Inside were the remnants of a life I used to live. A photo of Marin holding my hand on her first day of school. The paper crown she made me for Mother's Day in 2nd grade. Bestest mom ever. Scribbled in glitter glue. The sympathy cards from Frank's funeral. I hadn't meant to cry. But I did. Not loud sobs. Just a few tears that fell silently, like they'd been waiting for the right moment. I wasn't crying over the baby blanket. I was crying because somewhere along the way, I stopped being someone to them. Later that week, I ran into Elaine, my neighbor from 3 doors down. She was walking her dog, a wrinkly beagle named Gus, and paused when she saw me pruning my rose bush. "Joanna, you're finally retired, right? How's it feel?" I hesitated. "Quiet," I said. She smiled, unaware. "That's the dream." "Maybe for some." She mentioned a book club meeting that Thursday. Said I should come. "We're reading something light," she added. "Nothing heavy. Just wine and stories." I nodded, unsure if I would go. But Thursday night came, and I found myself putting on lipstick and slipping on a cardigan. It was either that or sit alone and watch reruns of a show I didn't even like. When I arrived, the women greeted me kindly. I recognized a few from the neighborhood. Some were single, some divorced, some newly widowed. And as the wine flowed and the discussion wandered away from the book, we began to talk. Really talk. About the quiet ache that comes when your children don't call. About birthdays spent alone. About how it feels to be told you're too emotional just because you still remember what it means to care deeply. They weren't angry. They weren't bitter. They were just tired. And in them, I saw myself. Elaine turned to me at one point and said, "You always seemed so composed, Joanna. I never imagined you had days like that." I gave a small laugh. I didn't used to. But then again, I didn't used to be invisible. They nodded. Every single one. That night, I walked home under a blanket of stars and thought about something one of the women said. Sometimes we don't fall apart. We just get smaller until we don't take up space anymore. I had spent the last 10 years shrinking, letting Marin's decisions overwrite mine, letting my love go unspoken so I wouldn't be accused of guilting her, letting myself become a relic in a house that I partly paid for. A few days later, I received a letter in the mail. It was from the school district, a formal notice congratulating me on my retirement and inviting me to speak at the next Board of Education meeting, a final send-off from the district. It felt odd, because I hadn't been told about it by Marin. Her husband was on the board. She must have known. But she hadn't told me. She hadn't invited me. She hadn't offered to attend. It was as if my retirement existed in two separate realities, the public one that praised me and the private one that quietly swept me under the rug. Still, I decided to attend. Not because I expected anything, but because I wanted to remember who I was before my role in her life became optional. I wore a soft gray pantsuit and pinned Frank's lapel pin near my collarbone. He used to wear it to every parent-teacher conference. When I arrived, the superintendent shook my hand, smiled, and said, "42 years, Mrs. Pierce. That's a legacy." I nodded and took my seat. During the meeting, a young teacher spoke about how my early guidance helped her survive her first year. Another thanked me for lending her a copy of Jane Eyre when the school library ran out. And for the first time in months, I felt real. Not through the eyes of someone who pitied me, but through the voices of people who remembered. Afterward, I lingered near the parking lot, unsure why I hadn't left yet. That's when I saw Marin's car. She stepped out, smoothing her coat, phone in hand. She saw me but didn't smile. "Mom," she said, walking over. "I didn't know you were going to be here." "You didn't know they were honoring me?" I asked softly. She hesitated. "I thought it was just a routine meeting. Thomas told me about it, but you didn't think to mention it." "Don't start, Mom." I looked at her, really looked. She was wearing heels too high for comfort, her hair pulled so tight it looked painful. Her eyes were tired, like maybe even she was exhausted by whatever performance she was trying to keep up. "I'm not starting anything," I said. "I'm just observing."
She sighed.
"You always make things bigger than they are." "No," I replied. "I think I've spent too long making myself smaller than I am." She blinked, then scoffed. "Honestly, Mom, I can't do this guilt trip tonight." And with that, she turned and walked away. I stood there, wind biting at my cheeks, and watched her go. Then I opened my car door, sat down, and didn't cry. Not this time. Because I was finally beginning to understand something crucial. It's not your job to make yourself lovable to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. That night, I wrote a list. At the top, I wrote, "What I have left that still belongs to me." And I began. My name, my voice, my home, my memories of Frank, the truth of what I gave,
My time.
my silence, my stories. And then I wrote a seventh item. 7. The family savings account Frank and I created before Marin was born. And I underlined it twice. Because suddenly, for the first time in a long while, I wondered, does she even remember I'm still the co-owner of that account? The next morning, I went to the bank. Not impulsively. Not with rage or revenge or even sadness. Just curiosity. That's how it starts sometimes, not with fire, but with a whisper. A small voice asking, "Am I still here?" I dressed simply. Navy sweater, gray slacks, the pearl earrings Frank gave me on our 15th anniversary. The woman in the mirror looked calm. But inside, I felt like a library book someone forgot to return. I walked into the bank branch downtown, the same one Frank and I had opened our first joint account in when we were newlyweds with $142 between us. Back then, we'd celebrated with fries and a milkshake afterward. I still remember the way he kissed the back of my hand and said, "To our future." The lobby hadn't changed much. The plastic plants were still dusty. The ceiling tiles still buzzed faintly with fluorescent light. I walked up to the desk. The clerk was young, polite. He smiled like I was someone's grandmother, and in that moment, I didn't correct him. "How can I help you today, ma'am?" I slid my ID across the desk. "I'd like to inquire about activity on a joint account. Joanna and Frank Pierce. Checking and savings. And the family trust fund tied to the same name." His fingers clicked across the keyboard. Then he hesitated. "You're listed as the primary on both," he said. "Is there a specific transaction you're looking for?" I smiled gently. "Show me the last 12 months." He turned the screen toward me. And there it was. Marin's name. Over and over. Transfers labeled childcare reimbursement. Renovation fund. Client dinner reimbursement. Over $47,000 withdrawn in a single year. And not once had I been told. The account was set up after Frank's death. It was meant to help Marin if she ever faced real hardship, tuition, emergencies, healthcare. And she knew that. We'd agreed together that it would be a just-in-case account, a safety net. But what I saw on that screen wasn't emergency spending. It was convenience. Private schooling for a toddler not yet old enough to write her name. A new kitchen island. A catered sip and see after the baby was born. And not one conversation. Not one phone call. Just silent withdrawals. Because she thought I wouldn't notice. Because she assumed I wouldn't care. Because she believed, in the deepest part of her, that my name didn't mean anything anymore. I sat still. The clerk waited for my response, his fingers frozen above the keyboard. "I'd like to change the terms on that account," I said evenly. "Of course. How would you like to proceed?" "I want dual authorization on every future transaction. My signature must be required for anything that leaves the account. No exceptions. And I'd like you to remove online access for all secondary users." He blinked. "That would revoke access for the cosigner." "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "That's the point." I walked out of the bank and stood on the sidewalk, watching cars roll by in a blur of morning traffic. The sky above was overcast. My reflection in the glass door behind me looked older than I remembered. But something about it felt stronger. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even hurt. I was done pretending that love meant never protecting myself. That afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table and pulled out the old filing cabinet from beneath the stairs. The bottom drawer stuck a little. Frank always said it had a temper. But inside were folders I hadn't opened in over a decade. The house deed, the trust account, my will, the college fund that had never been used. I flipped through them slowly. Not because I had a plan, but because I was remembering how I'd spent my whole life giving, not realizing that at some point, my daughter had stopped receiving my love as a gift and started treating it like an obligation. I wasn't ready to confront her. but I was ready to stop being surprised. The next morning, Marin called. It had been almost a week since the baby shower. Her number lit up my screen with that familiar hum of conflicted emotion. The mother part of me still wanted to smile at her name. The woman part of me was bracing for the inevitable. I let it ring twice before answering. "Hi, Mom," she said brightly, almost too brightly. "How are you?" "I'm well," I replied. Silence. Then, with forced casualness. "So? I got a notification this morning. Something about the bank account. Did you do something?" There it was. No pretense. No warm-up. Straight to the money. "Yes," I said calmly. "I adjusted the access settings." She didn't respond right away. Why? I took a deep breath. Because it was created to be used in emergencies. And I wasn't consulted about nearly $50,000 in spending. Her voice tightened. "Mom, you said that account was there to support my family." "I did," I agreed. "But I didn't say you could treat it like your personal ATM. You never said I couldn't. And you never asked if you still should." She went silent. Then, sharp and clipped. "So now I need your permission for everything?" "No, Marin," I said, letting my voice soften just slightly. "Now you need your respect. We didn't speak for 3 days. Not a word. I thought I would feel regret. But instead, I felt space. Room to breathe. Room I hadn't realized I needed until it was mine again. That weekend, I took a walk to the lake. The same lake Frank used to take Marin fishing at on Saturday mornings. I sat on the bench overlooking the water, wrapped in a knit shawl, the breeze cutting gently across my cheeks. I closed my eyes and whispered, "I'm still here, Frank." Not for him. For me. To remind myself that I hadn't disappeared. That I was still the woman who once held an entire family together on a shoestring and prayer. That my name still had weight. And from now on, I would carry it with both hands, not for others to drag behind them, but for me to finally walk upright again. 3 days after I resecured the bank account, I received a voicemail from Thomas. Polite. Measured. Just formal enough to be cold. "Hi, Joanna. This is Thomas Sinclair. Marin mentioned there were some adjustments to the financial account. I'm sure it's all a misunderstanding, but we'd really appreciate a quick conversation to clarify. Give me a call when you can." Clarify. That's a word people use when what they really mean is, "We don't like that you've remembered your power." I didn't return the call. Instead, I took a long bath that evening. The kind with lavender salts and a book I'd been meaning to finish since last year. For the first time in months, I didn't spend the entire soak thinking about Marin or what I did wrong, or how I could fix things. I just existed. Warm. Quiet. Whole. When I stepped out, my robe brushed against something soft on the hallway floor. It was the scrapbook. The one I'd made for Marin's wedding. I must have dropped it when I came home from the retirement party and forgot it in the chaos of grief. I picked it up slowly. Inside were snapshots of every milestone. Her first step, her first trophy, her first heartbreak. Every page had notes in my handwriting. Letters she wrote to Santa. Doodles from kindergarten. A pressed flower from our walk after Frank's funeral. I closed it gently, and I placed it in a box labeled private. Because not everything I created had to be given away anymore. The next day, I visited Michael Caldwell, our old estate attorney. Frank and I first met Michael 26 years ago, when we were trying to figure out how to plan for the future with a 5-year-old daughter and exactly one reliable car. He looked older now, thinner, but his eyes hadn't changed, sharp and kind. "Joanna Pierce," he said, standing to shake my hand. What a surprise. "I need your help," I said. "Not because something's wrong, but because I'm ready to make something right." He led me to his office, offered me tea, and waited. I pulled a folder from my purse. Inside were the documents for the Pierce Educational Trust, the account Frank and I had created when Marin was still in middle school. It had been intended for college, or, if not used, for her children's education one day. Except it had just been sitting there, forgotten, unused, still entirely under my control. I handed him the paperwork. "I want to restructure the trust," I said. I want to remove the assumption that Marin, or her husband, will inherit full control. And I want to rename it. To what? He asked. I smiled softly. The Eleanor Fund. After my mother. She taught school until she was 70 and never saw a dime of recognition. He sat back, considering. That's doable. What's your goal? I want the money to go to overlooked educators, women who spend their lives teaching and mentoring and then retire into silence. I want it to go to people who build legacies, not just resumes. Michael nodded slowly. You're not doing this out of spite. No, I said. I'm doing it out of clarity. He leaned forward. You understand this changes things legally. She may challenge it someday. Let her try, I said. She never even remembered the trust existed. Why should she care how I use it now? We began the process that day. Quietly, deliberately. It would take a few weeks to finalize. But the moment I signed the first set of forms, something shifted in my chest. Not revenge. Not victory. Just peace. The following Sunday, I received a group text. From Marin. Brunch next weekend at our place. Family only. RSVP by Thursday. Hope you can make it. No direct message. No apology. No conversation about the account. Just another invitation, like I was a +1 in my own family. I didn't respond. Not out of malice, but because I finally understood something. When people see your love as unlimited, they treat your silence as agreement. That week, I started spending my mornings at the library again. There was a program I used to help organize for adult learners, women who never got their high school diploma and were returning for GEDs. They met in a small room at the back, 3 days a week. I had stopped volunteering when Marin got pregnant. But now, I walked in, smiled at the new coordinator, and said, Do you need another tutor? She blinked. You're Miss Pierce, aren't you? I used to be, I smiled. Now, I'm just Joanna. They gave me a seat at the circled table near the windows. 4 women sat beside me. One of them, Patrice, was 52. Her husband had left her after 30 years. Another, Yasmin, was only 26 but raising 2 kids alone. She told me her son wanted to be a writer. I looked at her and said, Tell him to keep going. Writing saved me more times than I can count. That afternoon, I drove home with a stack of graded worksheets in my bag and a kind of joy I hadn't felt in years. The kind that comes from being useful, not used. On Thursday, Marin texted again. Are you coming Sunday or not? Please let me know. We've already ordered food. No, we miss you. No, how are you? Just logistics. Control disguised as courtesy. I stared at the screen and realized this wasn't motherhood anymore. This was management. And I was no longer applying for the job. I typed a short reply. I won't be attending. Wishing you all the best. And I hit send. No explanation. No soft cushion of guilt. Just the truth. That night, I opened my journal and wrote a sentence I hadn't been brave enough to admit until now. I am not just someone's mother. I am still someone. Then I added, and my name is still on more than just a birth certificate. It's on every document that still holds weight, and I intend to use that weight well. It was a rainy Tuesday when I first drove back to the cabin, the one Frank and I bought the summer after Marin turned 10. Nestled just outside Belmont, beside a quiet lake with a warped dock and creaky porch swing. It wasn't fancy, just 2 bedrooms, a fireplace that always needed coaxing, and a roof that groaned during storms. But it was ours. And until recently, I had almost forgotten it still was. Marin never asked about it. In fact, she probably assumed I'd sold it years ago. That was the thing about her. She never looked down to see the foundation I kept beneath her feet. I unlocked the cabin door with a rusted key that had sat on my kitchen hook for over a decade. The smell hit me instantly. Pine, old cedar, damp wood, and faint cinnamon from a forgotten candle somewhere in the kitchen drawer. I walked through the rooms like a ghost. Or maybe like someone returning to life. The blankets were still folded on the beds. The mason jar of dried marigolds still sat on the windowsill. A chipped mug rested in the sink with Frank's initials faded on the side. I touched the mantel above the fireplace where Marin's height had once been measured in sharp marks. Then I sat, just sat, and listened to the quiet. Not the suffocating kind I'd felt after my retirement party. This quiet felt like permission. Permission to rebuild. That night, I stayed. Slept under the heavy wool blanket we bought from that farmer's market years ago. Woke to birds instead of texts. Made coffee in the old percolator. Burnt toast. Didn't care. And I thought, not about Marin, not even about what she took, but about what I still had. A cabin no one remembered. A trust they had ignored. A name that still opened doors. And suddenly, for the first time in years, I wanted something of my own. Not just to protect what remained, but to build something new. 2 days later, I made another appointment with Michael Caldwell. "I've been thinking about the cabin," I said as I sat across from him. He glanced up from his notes. "Still in your name?" "Always was," I replied. "We never transferred it. Frank wanted it to be mine." Michael leaned back. "What do you want to do with it?" I didn't answer right away. Because the answer wasn't simple. I want to turn it into something useful. Something that matters. A space for women like me. Mothers who gave too much. Teachers who never got thanked. Widows who are tired of whispering grief into teacups. He raised an eyebrow. "You want to turn it into a retreat center?" "Something like that," I said. "Nothing grand. Just weekends of peace. Workshops. Maybe writing circles. Quiet healing for women who forgot their own names while trying to keep everyone else's dreams alive." He nodded slowly, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You're serious." "Dead serious," I said. "Call it the Franklin Pierce Center for Renewal. That man taught me that strength didn't need to be loud. I'd like to pass that on." He took notes. "I can draft the paperwork. You'll need to restructure part of the trust to allocate funds." "I've already begun," I replied. "I want part of the Eleanor Fund diverted." Quietly, anonymously. He chuckled. "You always did play the long game, Joanna." "No," I said, smiling gently. "I just finally stopped waiting for someone else to see me before I started living again." Back at the cabin, I opened every window and let the cold air sweep through. I stripped the beds, washed the dishes, dusted off the bookshelves. Found Frank's old notebook tucked behind a stack of crossword puzzles. Inside were sketches of a deck he planned to build someday. Someday. Funny how many things we save for later. Until later turns into a room full of unlived dreams. I didn't want to wait anymore. So I called a contractor the next morning. Asked for quotes. Asked for recommendations for ramps and walk-in showers. Not because I needed them now, but because I knew the women who would come might. That weekend, I invited Elaine from book club to visit the cabin. She gasped the moment she stepped inside. "This is beautiful," she whispered, running her fingers across the mantel. "Like something out of a novel." "Frank built most of it with his own hands," I said. "I just painted the porch swing." She sat by the window and turned to me, eyes misting. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because you asked me once if I was doing okay," I said. "And I wasn't. But now, I think I might be. And I'd like to offer that to someone else." She placed her hand on mine. "Joanna, this is more than a cabin." I nodded. "I know." On Sunday, I received another message from Marin. "You haven't responded about next weekend. We'd like to do a family photo for the baby's 6-month milestone. Thomas's parents will be there. Please dress appropriately." I stared at it for a long time. Then I typed, "I won't be attending. I'm spending the weekend with friends at the lake house." Seconds later, the dots appeared. Typing. Then, "What lake house?" I smiled to myself. And didn't respond. That night, I lit the fireplace and curled up with a journal I hadn't touched in years. I wrote a single sentence at the top of the page. "I am not lost. I was simply waiting for silence to sound like freedom." And beneath it, "The world may not clap for women like me, but I can build a stage anyway." It took less than a week for the silence to rattle them. 3 days after I didn't show for the baby's 6-month photo shoot, Marin called. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was clipped, her tone vaguely pleasant in the way people speak when they're trying not to admit they're afraid. "Hey, Mom. Just checking in. Not sure if you're still upset about things, but we'd really like to see you." Thomas says hi. I didn't respond, not because I was angry, but because for the first time, I wasn't available emotionally, logistically, or spiritually for their carefully curated version of family. That Sunday, I made lemon cake. Not for anyone else.
Just for me.
I cut one thick slice and delivered the rest to the GED class. Patrice cried when I handed her a Tupperware container. "No one's made me dessert in years," she whispered. I told her. Then it's about time someone did. 2 days later, I got a message from Thomas. An email. Formal. Transactional. Subject. Clarification needed. Family accounts. "Hi, Joanna. We noticed some recent changes to the trust and associated accounts. We're a bit unclear on how funds are being reallocated. Please let us know if there's a time to discuss. Marin and I would prefer to handle this directly without involving third parties. Best. Thomas." It read like a lawyer, trying not to sound like one. I closed the email and stared at the floor for a long time. I had once paid the down payment on their house. I had brought soup when they were sick, cleaned their kitchen during Marin's 3rd trimester, and sat in silence in hospital waiting rooms just to be near. Now I was a line item they couldn't account for. A variable they had assumed would never change. I didn't respond. Instead, I called Michael. "Tell me," I asked, "is everything finalized?" He clicked through his computer. "The Eleanor Fund is fully restructured. The retreat is protected under a nonprofit designation. And you are listed as sole decision-maker for all associated accounts." I nodded. "Good. Then let's make it official. Draft a letter." "To them?" "No," I said. "To the Board of Education, the local Women's Foundation, and the Regional Teachers Union. Let's announce the launch of the Franklin Pierce Center for Renewal."
He paused.
"You're really doing this?" "I'm already doing it," I replied. The press release went out the following week. A short write-up. A single photo, me standing outside the lake house with a small group of women from the GED program. Nothing flashy. No grand gesture. Just truth. It ran in the Belmont Courier on a Thursday. By Friday morning, my phone rang 5 times. Old students. Former colleagues. One local radio station who asked if I'd come on air to speak about redefining retirement. I said yes to none of them. But I said yes to myself. I said yes to the woman who once stayed up until 3 a.m. grading essays by flashlight. To the woman who never asked for a single thank you but had earned them 100 times over. To the mother who finally understood that love without boundaries is not love, it's servitude. On Saturday morning, I arrived at the cabin to find something on the porch. A bouquet of pink carnations. And a card. I don't know what to say, so I'll start with this. "I'm sorry.
Can we talk?"
Marin. I stood there with the card in my hand and let the wind whip through my sweater. She hadn't called me Mom in the note. She hadn't mentioned the baby. Or Thomas. Or the accounts. Just, "I'm sorry." And for a moment, I didn't know how to feel.
Part of me wanted to cry.
Another part wanted to throw the card into the lake. But the part of me that had spent the last month rediscovering herself, the woman who had reopened old spaces and made them new, simply walked inside. I placed the flowers in a jar by the window. And I didn't call her back. Because I needed one more weekend of quiet before I opened that door. That evening, a knock came at the cabin door. Not loud. Hesitant. I opened it to find Marin standing there alone. No stroller. No husband. Just her, in a raincoat, hair a little windblown, makeup undone.
"Hi," she said.
I stepped aside. She walked in slowly, looking at the space like it was a museum. "I forgot how small it was," she said softly. "And how warm." I didn't respond. She turned to me. "I saw the article." I nodded. "It's beautiful," she said. "I didn't know you were planning something like this." "You never ask." That landed. She sat down on the edge of the couch like she wasn't sure she was allowed to stay. I stayed standing. "I don't expect you to forgive me overnight," she said. "But I wanted to see you." "That's new," I replied, my voice calm. wanting to see me, not just what I could bring. She winced. I deserve that. I don't need you to admit fault, Marin, I said, crossing my arms gently. I just need you to see the full picture. I spent decades trying to matter quietly. And you, both of you, treated me like an afterthought. I know, she said, her voice shaking. I thought I was just doing what people do when they become parents, creating space, defining boundaries. But I didn't realize I was erasing you in the process. I didn't reply right away, because that was the first time she used that word, erasing, and it was exactly what I had felt. She stood, took a step closer. I don't know how to fix this. I met her eyes. You can't fix it, I said, because it's not broken. It's rearranged. I'm not moving backward anymore, Marin. You can come forward if you want, but I'm not shrinking again. Her eyes welled. And for the first time since she was a little girl, she nodded like she understood that this wasn't a phase. This was a return to self. I walked her to the door. She paused on the steps. I brought you something else, she said, reaching into her bag. A photo. Her baby, wrapped in the knit blanket I had made. I'm sorry we didn't open it that day. I found it in a closet last week. He sleeps with it now. Every night. I took the photo in my hands. And I didn't say a word. Not yet. Because healing doesn't arrive on command. But it had arrived. Like a cautious guest finally welcomed into a room that had once been too full of silence. The morning after Marin left the cabin, I sat at the kitchen table with the photo of her son in my hands. The blanket I'd made wrapped tightly around him. His cheeks rosy. Eyes closed. That open-mouthed sleep babies fall into when they feel completely safe. He was beautiful. But I didn't cry. Because the ache wasn't as sharp anymore. It was still there, yes. Years of being unseen don't dissolve in one apology and a picture. But something had changed. Not in Marin. In me. I didn't feel erased anymore. I felt chosen. By myself. And that was new. Later that week, I returned to town to finalize paperwork with Michael. The Franklin Pierce Center for Renewal was now fully funded and recognized by the state. The cabin was officially a nonprofit retreat space. The Eleanor Fund would begin accepting applications for small grants for retired women educators by the following month. Do you want to do a ribbon-cutting ceremony? Michael asked. I laughed.
No.
I've spent enough time being dressed up for other people's agendas. Let's let the work speak for itself. But I did take a photo. Just one. Me on the porch, holding the ledger of names from the GED class. Patrice had signed hers with a smiley face and a shaky heart. I sent the photo to Marin. No caption. Just the truth. That Friday, Marin called again. This time, I picked up. Hi, she said, hesitant. I hope it's okay that I called. You don't need permission, I said. But I think I used to assume I always had it, she replied. I didn't disagree. There was a pause, then she said, we were thinking of coming out to the cabin this weekend. Just the three of us. No expectations. I'd understand if you said no. I didn't say yes. But I didn't say no either. I'll leave the porch light on, I said. They arrived just before dusk. No baby bag parade. No catered pastries. Just Marin, her husband Thomas, quiet, sheepish, and the baby asleep in a sling across her chest. Thomas shook my hand. Marin hugged me, tighter than she had in years. We spent the evening around the fire pit. Not reminiscing. Not rehashing. Just sitting. It was the first time in a long time that the silence between us didn't feel like a wall. It felt like rest. Later, as the baby stirred, Marin whispered, He knows your voice. He quiets when he hears it. I didn't respond. Because that was enough. More than any apology. The next morning, over coffee, Marin glanced at the lake and said, So many summers here. I nodded. You loved catching fireflies. You always made me hot cocoa after, she said. Even when it was 80 degrees. That's what mothers do, I said. She looked at me, eyes filled with something unspoken. Do you think I'll be like you? I let the question hang in the air. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because I wanted her to feel the weight of it. Maybe, I said, but only if you remember who you were before you became everything to someone else. Her mouth parted slightly, and she nodded, as if finally she understood. That afternoon, I gave her a copy of the revised trust. Her eyes widened as she flipped through the pages. This is all real. Yes. And I'm not the sole heir anymore. No, I said gently. You were never entitled to everything, Marin. You just thought my silence meant agreement. She swallowed hard. I know it doesn't fix things, she said. It's not meant to, I replied. It's meant to protect the things that matter, including me. She reached across the table and took my hand.
Thank you, she said.
For still letting me be part of your story. I looked at her and smiled, the kind that carried 1,000 layered years.
You're not part of it, I said.
You're just not the whole thing anymore. That evening, as they drove away, the baby in the back seat, Marin rolled down the window and said, I'd like to come back. Not for anything. Just to come. I'd like that, I replied. But I didn't watch them drive off. Instead, I turned toward the cabin, stepped onto the porch, and sat down beside the ledger again. The sun dipped low across the water. The dock groaned in its familiar rhythm, and the woman I had become sat back and exhaled. Not with grief, not with rage, with ownership of her name, her story, her space. And for the first time in years, I felt no urge to reach, not to fix, not to chase, not even to teach, just to be. It had been nearly a month since Marin left the lake house with the baby. Since then, there had been no grand apology, no dramatic scene, just small gestures, a slow, cautious reshaping. She started calling once a week, not to ask for anything, just to talk. The calls were short at first. Weather, the baby's sleeping habits, her favorite grocery store finally restocking those hazelnut biscuits I used to buy. But I noticed something in her voice. Softening. Not weakness. Not guilt. Humility. The kind that only comes when someone realizes they've been living a version of the truth that was never fully theirs to claim. One afternoon, I was sitting on the lake house porch reading grant applications for the Eleanor Fund when my phone buzzed. It was Marin again. Hey, Mom. We're organizing a community fundraiser for the literacy program. I know it's last minute, but would you consider speaking at the event? Not as my mother, as Joanna Pierce, the woman who changed lives. I stared at the message for a long time, not because I doubted its sincerity, but because I didn't need it. And that made all the difference. That night, I opened the bottom drawer of the desk in the cabin, Frank's drawer. Inside, wrapped in tissue, was the retirement plaque I received from Westbridge High. Joanna Pierce, 42 years of service. Beloved educator, mentor, legacy. For months, it had sat in that drawer untouched. But now, I unwrapped it, not because I needed proof of what I'd done, but because I was finally proud of what I was still becoming. I placed it on the wall beside the fireplace, between the framed announcement of the Eleanor Fund and the first thank you letter from a grant recipient. And for the first time, that corner didn't feel like a shrine. It felt like a future. The following week, I returned to the community center in town to meet with a group of women from the GED program. They wanted to start a writing circle. We just want a space, Yasmin said, shy but hopeful, to say things we've never been allowed to say out loud. I brought them spiral notebooks and pens from the dollar store. Nothing fancy. But when I passed them out, their eyes lit up like I'd handed them gold. That's the thing people forget. The right tools in the right hands can rebuild entire lives. We wrote in silence for the first 10 minutes. Then I said, if you'd like, you can share. But only if you feel safe. Patrice cleared her throat and read a poem about folding laundry for 3 decades and never once being asked if she was tired. The room went still. No one spoke. No one pitted. They just listened. Because silence can be sacred when it's not forced. Back at the cabin, I received an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a small note card. One sentence, handwritten. I heard what you're building. My mother could have used a place like that. No signature.
Just those words.
I placed the note in the ledger, alongside the first donor check I'd received, $25, and a card that read, "For the woman who taught me that I mattered, even when no one else said so." A few days later, I stood in front of a small crowd at the community fundraiser Marin had mentioned. It was in the gymnasium at Westbridge High, the same floor where I'd handed out essay prompts, comforted breakups, sat through hundreds of parent-teacher conferences where I fought for kids whose parents hadn't shown up. I stood behind the podium in a plain navy blouse and soft gray slacks. No speech in hand, just memory and clarity. I was once asked why I didn't leave this town after Frank died. I began. Why I stayed when my daughter left, when the house grew quiet, when the work got heavy. I looked around the room. At the time, I didn't have an answer, but now I do. I smiled. I stayed because I believed in roots, in people, in second chances. I stayed because sometimes the most radical thing you can do is remain, even when you've been forgotten. Silence. Then applause. Not thunderous, but real. Afterward, Marin hugged me. Not like a daughter desperate for forgiveness, like a woman who had finally seen her mother. That night, I returned to the cabin alone, lit the fireplace, and poured myself a glass of wine I'd been saving, to toast something I had once thought was lost forever. Self-worth. Not the kind you earn by being needed, but the kind that comes from knowing you don't have to be needed to be enough. I picked up my pen and wrote in my journal, I am not waiting anymore. Not for recognition. Not for permission. I am the architect now, and the blueprints are mine. The first real snow came early that year. I stood at the cabin window, coffee in hand, watching it settle over the trees like a blessing. The lake had begun to freeze at the edges, soft and glassy, catching the white flakes as they fell. The world outside looked still, but inside me, everything had shifted. It had been nearly 6 months since the baby shower. 5 since I restructured the trust. 3 since Marin stood on my porch, not with expectation, but with humility. She still called once a week, sometimes twice. Not always to talk about the baby, sometimes just to read me something she found funny, or to tell me about a bad day. She never asked for money, never referenced the accounts. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And real, I had learned, is enough. The Franklin Pierce Center for Renewal had welcomed its first 3 retreat weekends. 10 women in total. Single mothers. Divorced teachers. A widow who hadn't taken off her wedding ring in 8 years. We didn't do anything elaborate. We cooked together. Walked the shoreline in silence. Sat by the fire and said things we'd never said aloud. One evening, Yasmin, the young mother from the GED program, stood in the cabin doorway and said, I think this is the first time I've ever felt like I was someone's daughter again. Not by blood, just by care. I placed a hand over hers. You don't need to be anyone's daughter, I said. You're already someone.
She cried.
Not because she was sad, because she believed me. One morning, I opened the cabin mailbox and found a package. Inside was a small frame, a photo of Marin holding her son, both of them wrapped in the knit blanket I'd made. Beneath it was a handwritten note. I used to think being a good daughter meant doing everything right. Now I think it just means learning how to listen, especially when it's hardest. Thank you for teaching me, even when I wasn't kind.
Love.
Marin. I placed the photo on the windowsill, not on a shrine, not on display, just where the morning sun could find it. That Sunday, I drove into town to visit the park where Frank and I used to take Marin as a child. I sat on the same bench, old and worn, beneath the cherry tree that now had more bark than bloom. I pulled a small journal from my purse, the one I'd been filling since this journey began. And on the last page I wrote, this is where the old chapter ends. Not because I've been forgiven, not because I've been applauded, but because I remembered that the story was always mine to begin with. I was never waiting to be chosen. I was simply waiting to stop waiting. My name is Joanna Pierce. I was a teacher, a wife, a mother. But more than that, I am still here, and I still have things to say. The next week, I hosted Marin at the cabin. No baby, no husband, just us. We made soup together, talked about books. She asked questions about Frank, about my childhood, things she'd never thought to ask when she assumed I'd always be around, quietly available. At one point, she paused while chopping carrots and said, "It's strange. I always thought you'd been holding something back, but now I see you'd just been holding it all." I nodded, and now I've started giving some of it back to myself. That evening, as she left, she turned on the porch steps. "I'm not sure I'll ever deserve what you've given me," she said quietly. I stepped forward and kissed her forehead. "You don't have to deserve it," I said. "You just have to see it." She nodded, and this time, I watched her drive away not with sorrow, but with something else. Gratitude. Because I had not waited for her to change in order to save myself. I had changed first, and in doing so, I showed her how. Months later, the first spring at the retreat came. The lake melted early that year. I stood barefoot on the dock one morning, toes curling against the sun-warmed wood. The birds called above. Somewhere inside, the kettle began to whistle. The new guests would be arriving in a few hours. And I stood there, heart full, hands empty, for once. Because I didn't need to hold on to anything anymore. Not regret, not apology, not expectation. I looked out at the water and whispered, "Thank you." To Frank, to the quiet, to the woman I had become. And for the first time, I didn't whisper it to the wind, hoping someone else would hear. I whispered it to myself. Because now I knew I was never erased. I was simply unwritten. And now I'm the one holding the pen. If Joanna's story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful stories that remind us we don't have to wait to be chosen. We already are.